Today we're going to be working in watercolor. So you're going to need your watercolor box from your art bag, your watercolor brush, a container to put water in. I have a glass jar, but it could be plastic, a cup, but something you can put water in. We're going to need our crayons, but the only color we're going to need is our white crayon, a piece of good drawing paper from your art bag, and a pencil. So first we're going to fold our paper. So we have our drawing paper. We're going to fold it in half and crease that, and then fold it in half again. I'm folding the top down and crease that, and fold it in half one more time. When I open up my paper, I want to have 8 rectangles or boxes. Okay, and we are going to take a few notes on the back, and then we're going to paint on the front. So let's start. Before we take our notes, in our very first box, we're going to put our information. So our name, and period, and art class, and date. And this is 2/15 for me today, and this is Watercolor Techniques. Okay, for some of you this will be new, for some of you this will be review, but it's always good to review. Okay, so now we're going to turn our paper over on the back. And we have several basic watercolor techniques that we are going to be doing. The first one is called a wash, W-A-S-H, and that's wet paint on dry paper. So the first technique when we turn our paper over, we are going to do is a flat wash. And that's where the color and value stay the same. The next technique we're going to do is called a graded wash. A graded wash, and that's where the value changes from dark to light. The next technique we're going to do is called wet into wet, and that means we will have wet paint on wet paper. And so it's going to, the paint is going to respond a certain way. The next technique we're going to do is wet on dry. And that is wet paint on dry paper. So that means we're going to have 2 layers of color. And this one we'll have to let dry in between, okay? Our next one is wax resist. And wax resist means using wax And I'm writing down white wax, but we can actually use any light color to keep color away. So for some of you, you may have dyed Easter eggs. It's the same principle. And so basically we're using the white wax or the light colored wax to create highlights on our object. And our last one is dry brush. And dry brush means that we use dry paint, that is less water in the paint. And brush. On dry paper. And why that's important is that gives us texture. Okay, so if I was painting a wood table, a wood fence, or plants like brush, weeds, I might want to use dry brush. Okay, and so it's about texture. All right, so when we are working with watercolor, one of the first things we need to do is we are not using brown or black today. We're going to take our brush and dip it in the water and squeeze a drop of water into each pan of color that we might want to use today. And you'll notice my brush is not touching the watercolor pans. It doesn't really matter if your pans are square or oval. It's going to work the same way. The other thing is you'll notice that I have my lid facing me, and that's because that's where I'm going to mix the colors. And you might also want to have a paper towel or rag handy because we'll need to maybe wipe out our tray. Okay? Those are going to sit for a minute, and while those are sitting, I want us to label our boxes that we're going to use. Box number 1 is going to be flat wash. Box number 2 is going to be graded wash. Box number 3 is wet into wet. Box number 4 is wet on dry. Box number 5 is wax resist. And our last box is dry brush. And then we have one space left over, so if we decide that we goofed, we have one space that we can work with if we think we can do it better. Okay? All right, now our color choice is very important when we choose watercolors. And we're going to do a flat wash first. And then because we need to let our wet on dry, we're going to do that second. Okay, so for our flat wash, we are going to pick a warm color. And when we're using our watercolor, we're going to put the water and paint in our lid and then add a couple drops of water. One of the mistakes that watercolor that students make when using watercolor is they don't use enough water. Okay, so it is called watercolor. So now I'm going to use this color for my flat wash. When I have a flat wash, I want to make sure I have enough paint, so I'm going to try to paint a rectangle. I'm overlapping the brush strokes, and I want to be sure that I have enough paint to paint the whole rectangle. And then I'm going to come back and smooth out the edges and that's it. Watercolor needs to be very fresh. I don't paint it over it bunches of times. Okay, now I'm going to rinse my brush, and I'm going to take a second color. So now we're going to do our flat wash for the wet on dry, but I'm changing the color. So I got some yellow and I made my own orange. Whatever I make is going to be different than the orange in my box. And now I'm going to do a wet on dry here. And again, then I'm going to come back and straighten out the edges a little bit, make sure I haven't skipped any places. And now I'm going to let that area dry. So by the time we have finished our other samples, this should be dry enough to do step 2. Okay, now before we go on, if I have a lot of extra water, I can pinch out my brush, and I can use my brush kind of like a sponge, and I can soak up some of the extra watercolor. So I don't really want to brush over it, but if I have too much water at the edge, I can pick up some of that extra color. Otherwise, let watercolor flow. And the paper might wrinkle a little bit, but I really want it to be fresh. If I brush over it a bunch of times, it's not going to work out very well. Okay, now we're going to do our graded wash next. Graded wash, remember, changes value. So for this, I want you to use a cool color. And I'm going to get 2 colors side by side, and I'm going to mix them together. And a graded wash starts dark at the top. Then I'm going to add a couple drops of water, and my next 2 brush strokes are going to overlap, and then I'm going to add more water. I'll make 2 brush strokes. I'll add more water. And that time I did 3 brush strokes. And now I'm just going to use the water from my jar. So you'll notice it is very fluid. So on this one, if I have a big puddle of water here, I'm just going to let the brush pick up that extra water at the end. And this top is kind of light, so I might just put a little bit more color there to let it flow. We should be able to see the watercolor gradually go from dark to light. And this is one that we might want to use our extra rectangle at the end for if we don't like how it turns out. But we need to let it sit for a little bit. Okay? Our next technique is wet into wet. For this one especially, I want to stay away from the fold. Remember that if our paper isn't totally flat, or if we get too much water, all the colors will run together. So you'll notice in all of my samples, I did not paint up to the fold. That's going to be important. Okay, wet into wet. Let's start with, I'm taking yellow, and remember with watercolor, it's super important that you rinse your brush between changing colors. And I'm going to paint a flat wash here with a warm color. And then I'm going to take a contrasting color, and I'm choosing a warm color, and I'm going to make some marks. So I'm going to draw right across, and you might want to draw onto the dry paper where there is no color, and you can see how the paint is spreading. That's what wet into wet does. Okay. Next, we also call this bleeding. Okay. So the colors kind of spread together. We're going to take our white crayon next, and we're going to outline some shapes. You might think about rain. Make some patterns. We're not coloring in any solid shapes. I'm not making a solid white square. I might try making a grass pattern since we've been working with some pen and ink textures. And now I'm going to use a cool color. Now I used violet here, so and I mixed it with blue. So now let's try something different. Let's try green and violet mixed together. Okay, so a darker color is going to work better here. And we want to be sure that we have water in our paint and that we have that. I lost my green, so I'll add a little more green in there. Okay, so now I'm going to move with my brush across where I drew with the white wax, and it's almost like magic. You can see the marks that I made appearing, and we're going to use that approach when we want to put highlights on our objects or show texture. Okay, all right. We'll go ahead and finish our dry brush. So for the dry brush, I'm rinsing my brush and I'm going to dry it. When I dry my brush, I'm not pulling on the bristles, I'm just touching it together. And then I'm going to kind of pinch my brush to spread out the bristles. And with watercolor, the water runs to the center of the pan. So for dry brush, I'm going to use from the edge of the pan. And when I use the dry brush, I should see the lines. It's almost like painting with a broom. Let's try another color. Okay, not very much there. Let's get it wet. Squeeze out the water again, spread the bristles, and from the edge of the pan, so there's a red. So you can try a couple different colors. Now, this is what it would look like. Let's try the red that is not dry brush. There's the contrast of difference. So this is not dry brush. This is the effect we want. Let's do one more. Let's try green. From the edge of the pan, so I can see the texture that the brush bristles are making on the paper. Okay, that looks good. All right, now it looks like our wet on dry is dry enough. The paper is no longer shiny. If I look at these other ones, I can see where the paper is very shiny. That's because it is still very wet. So we again need a contrast in color. So I'm going to think about the color wheel, and on the color wheel, this is more orange. And so the opposite of orange is blue. So I'm going to use a blue-violet mix, and I'm going to make marks similar to the ones I made on the wet into wet, so I kind of have a comparison. And again, you might want to go off the edge onto the dry paper. So you can see on the wet on dry, the techniques did not spread or bleed. On the wet into wet, they did bleed. Okay? Now, On my flat wash, my paper was a little bit wet, so I got these kind of stain marks. That's fine, we're gonna let that go. But I think I could do a better graded wash, so I'm going to use this space here to do another graded wash and try maybe a little bit less water and a little bit more paint. So 2 strokes with the brush. And I'm going to do 3 strokes. And I have extra space, so if I need more variation in value, I can move over to another space. Yes, that's getting much better results. And you can see how the pigment is kind of moving down. And again, I'm going to use my brush to soak up the extra water at the end, or I might even use water straight from the jar. Okay, now in watercolor, as I'm noticing the color of the water change, or if the water starts to change the colors I'm using, that's when I know it's time for me to get new water. Okay, let this dry, and when it's dry, this is going to be your first assignment, the review of watercolor techniques. You will need to turn in a picture of the vocabulary on the back, but remember your paper needs to be dry, and then take a picture of the front. Or you can do a picture of the front first, but remember it has to be dry before you take a picture of the back. Okay, so that is assignment number 1, a review of watercolor techniques.